and welcome to World Talks here on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. What might have passed as a provocative speech now seems to be taking on a life of its own. President-elect Donald Trump has quite openly suggested a U.S. territorial expansion. Speaking from his private Florida club, President-elect Trump refused to rule out using force to retake the Panama Canal and to claim Greenland. Mark Toth, national security expert, joins us now to throw some light on Donald Trump's latest foreign policy plans. Welcome back, Mark, to TVP World, and as always, thanks for taking the time.
Great to see you, Ashim. Thank you.
Thank you. So what are we to make of this? Let's look at Panama and Greenland separately. Let's start with Panama. What is Donald Trump saying about Panama? What has upset him, and what's brought this on?
Right. Ashim, let me quickly preface this by saying I don't condone the approach that Donald Trump has taken. I don't think you treat allies this way in terms of what Washington should be doing or not. So having said that, I'm simply trying to explain or read the tea leaves, if you will, of what's happening. I think with respect to Panama, indeed, really, frankly, with respect to Greenland, what we're really seeing here, if we dig deep, is intended messaging more for China than for anyone else. In Trump's world, he's got China hawks rising in the national security sphere, and they're concerned about the economic encroachment, if you will, of China on U.S. interests in Central and Latin America, or South America, as well as in the North Atlantic, and they're looking at ways to how to mitigate that. So from that standpoint, I think this is a shot across more China's bows, but obviously, you've got Panama sitting there highly offended by the approach.
Yes, but there are reports that China is actually controlling access to the Panama Canal, which of course is at the root of this. So it's more than just upsetting Panama. It's actually it's about saying our national security is at risk. Do you think that he has a point there?
He does. And I mean, if you look back to previous statements from the Biden administration, including the now just retired General Richardson, who was in charge of South Command, or Southern Command there, Southcom as we call it, for South America, she was saying, look, China is trying to encroach militarily, and it's a problem, and it needs to be addressed. And certainly in Biden's own national security strategy, he's spelled out the Western Hemisphere as being the one that has the most impact on U.S. national security. So, the legitimacy is there. Certainly right now, in my opinion, what we're seeing is initially it's an economic attempt to negatively affect U.S. interests throughout the region. But as we've seen in Africa and elsewhere, China is slowly starting to militarize these ports and these energy facilities that they're building as part of their Belt and Pick Road, and that becomes a threat. I mean, we've seen the spaceport in Djibouti, we've seen the deep sea water ports that have happened in Djibouti as well as Sudan, and then container ports, for instance, in Egypt. So if you circle back to Panama, while it's not as wide scale, they still do have some agreements to run port facilities there, and that's of concern for the U.S.
And it's a choke point, of course, for naval and other shipping going through it. Let's go to Greenland now. It sounds as though this is basically, he's trolling them, isn't he?
He is, and Ashim, you actually brought up a good point. If I could quickly comment on this, it's not just the choke point in Panama that we need to be concerned about. It's also the Straits of Magellan and the Drake Passage, because China has been trying to build in Chile, right there at the end of the world, if you will, another port facility that would have a dual use. So if you're the Trump administration coming in and you're the China hawks, you're seeing China trying to affect you there in South America at the very tip, in Panama in the middle, and then now on to your point about Greenland. And I think it's the same thing, but a different focus. It's more about the Arctic and the militarization that the incoming Trump administration fears that ultimately will come about, not just from China, but in partnership with Russia.
Yes, well, we've seen some of that in the Baltic, have we not? With Russia's so-called shadow fleet being responsible for cutting undersea cables. So there is some, if you like, history to this behaviour. Now. Is Donald Trump, when he says that he wants to buy Greenland, is this simply a way, his starting position, if you like? Of course, he wrote the book The Art of the Deal. Is this simply a deal-making approach? And is he really only looking to have greater influence over Greenland rather than actually buying it?
Yeah, I think when it comes to Trump, you've got to kind of view him as a magician. And again, I'm not saying I like this, but he clearly is someone that practices the art of distraction in his deal making. So if he's saying these kind of outlandish things and suggesting that, he might even be willing to take these places by force, I think we have to be careful. He's probably trying to achieve something else and let the headline carry the day while he's trying to do something else behind the scenes. But in terms of Greenland, yes. I mean, overall, he is a man who tends to look at things economically, and he may get the economic threat, and there indeed is one that China represents to U.S. interests in the North Atlantic region, as well as the Arctic, as I mentioned a few minutes ago. But ultimately, I believe, based on the people that he's surrounding himself, what I would call China hawks, I don't say that negatively, but people fear and realize that China is a legitimate pacing threat to the U.S. They're saying that the economic threats that are being represented potentially in the Arctic, and for people that don't know, this northern sea route that I'm talking about extends from the Bering Sea between Siberia and Alaska all the way back to the Berings and to the Kara Straits and the Barents Sea just north of Murmansk, north of Poland, if you will, across the Baltic Sea. It's a concern that at some point they become dual use. In other words, they're there for economic reasons, but then they become militarized. And then suddenly you have a U.S. that's woefully underprepared to confront any kind of military threat in the Arctic. For instance, we have 2 Arctic icebreakers. We're not ready to fight that kind of conflict in that region, let alone defend it.
Right. Okay. So a more muscular response to China in this area. Now, what do we expect Xi Jinping's response to be?
Yeah, Ishim, it's a good question, and I think it's already underway. I think what we're seeing here is a back and forth already between Trump and Xi in terms of, sanctions were just announced in Beijing that really were not so much aimed at the Biden administration that's going to be gone in 12 days, but more aimed at sending a message to Trump that we're going to take you on. We're not going to take this silently. So I think this is just some back and forth that we're seeing with Trump and those guys and his team going back at China and saying, look, Xi, we're not going to cave on this. This is something that we believe is central to U.S. national security, and we're going to push this. So there's a lot of brinkmanship going on right now, and I think Trump is trying to do that through economic messaging. Again, I wish he took a different tact. I do think it was a bit of an I gotcha question yesterday in the media that I understand why people seized upon it. But when you really look at it and in the comments that Trump made, it wasn't that he was suggesting that military force was going to be the first thing that he used. What he really was basically saying, he couldn't rule out military force if China somehow, became involved in the Panama Canal or in the future, obviously no time soon. China doesn't have the capability either, made moves in terms of Canada or on Greenland and the Arctic.
Right. Now, Mark, perhaps you'll help me understand something. On the one hand, we hear that China's economy is actually teetering on the verge of collapse. They do have some major problems, and yet they seem to be spreading their economic and political clout and military clout across the world with barely a pause in breath. How do the two kind of balance each other?
Ashim, this is in my own personal worldview. I think totalitarian states like China, like Russia, can withstand better than Western democracies, economic turmoil and disruption. And from that standpoint, if we look at China, really, I think we have to be cautious about just looking at it as an economic model as opposed to a military model, because Xi has made a huge investment in terms of modernizing China's military, and that's essentially what he's geared his economy to do. And so, yes, it's having woes, and yes, he'll have to address those, and yes, there's fearful of implications of that at the local levels. We just saw him having to bail out at the state level 1.4 trillion off the top of my head to local provinces that are going bankrupt. So there's real internal problems. But at the same time, we continue to see him investing in the Belt and Road Initiative abroad. They've just most recently talked about what they want to do is a Polar Silk Road. That's referring back to this Northern Sea Route. They're seeing an opportunity to seize upon what Russia's been doing, be heavy investors in that, and get some control over it. China, if you look to their foreign policy statements of late, have also been intimating that they view themselves as a near-Arctic power, and that gives them the right to defend their Arctic interests. So they're laying the groundwork for saying that, we're going to economically invest in this region. But if we just look at the TVs around the world where they've done that, and at this point, Africa, sub-Saharan Africa is positive, they're eventually going to try to militarize that as well to secure those routes. That's what they want to do. And we're seeing it even closer to the shores. I'll just add quickly here. If you look at what they're doing in this South China Seas with the Philippines, the Filipino shipping and the like, they're interdicting. They're the ones using force to try to maintain shipping lanes. And in the meantime, they're trying to use economics to strangle, Western shipping lanes in the Atlantic as well as, South America.
Right, and let's not forget their saber rattling about Taiwan, and we'll wait to see what happens.
Absolutely.
What happens there. Now, just before I let you go, Mark, Canada, and again, Trump was talking about making it the 51st state. And then we've got the resignation of Prime Minister Trudeau. Any connection between the two?
I don't think so. In my opinion, Trudeau collapsed from his own internal pressure. It was already deeply unpopular, and I think, if anything, if you assign anything to Trump, it was a kind of a coup de grace shot. Having grown up with a lot of Canadians, I don't sense that Canada is ready anytime soon to become part of the United States. They're proud of their independence, rightly so. I think this more has to do with Trump. Again, part of this messaging, I would throw Canada as part of NORAD into that same concern about China and the need for them to be up in the defense. At this point, Canada is only spending 1.4% of its GDP on NATO versus Poland's 4.5%. And I think that's got Trump upset because he wants everyone to be at least 2.5, and he's already targeting 3. So I think some of this is just trolling that Trump is doing, but it's also inadvertent messaging. Again, I don't agree with the approach, but that's what, in my opinion, we're seeing out of him.
Right. Any thoughts on what we might expect from what may well be a Conservative government taking over in Canada?
At this point, I don't. I think you probably see some more alignment with Trump in that regard. Similar things were pushing the Canadian population to make the decision that they did that affected the U.S. elections. Obviously, 2 different countries, 2 different ways of looking at government. So I could see where there's some partnership opportunities there. And it just could be that, Trump in his own mind is saying, hey, and again, I'm not approving of this, but he may be trying to put Trudeau and the Liberal Party down for the count just to make it easier for the Conservatives to come in and, potentially win this, upcoming battle, and then also, obviously, have more conservative-type favorable policies that would be more to Trump's liking, especially in the economic sphere.
Right. Well, there's certainly likely to be some synergy between the 2 leaders if that were to happen. Mark Toth, thank you, as always, for coming along and sharing your insights and analysis with our audience. We look forward to welcoming you again soon. Thank you. Have a good day, sir.
Thank you, Ashim, and Happy New Year to you and all of your viewers. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Same to you, Mark. Bye now. And that's all from us in this episode of World Talks. Goodbye.